Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And we're going to probably be talking about all of those today with my guest, Lee Phillips, who is the author of Austerity Ecology and the Collapse Porn Addicts, A Defense of Growth, Progress, Industry, and Stuff. Lee, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Hi, Robert. Good to be here.
I warned you, my guests introduced themselves. So now I've given the title of your book, but right. I'm sure you can introduce yourself well. Give us 30 or 45 seconds as a brief introduction, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I'm also a science writer, or in fact, that's mainly what I am. I'm mainly a science writer. My works appeared in Nature, New Scientist, MIT Technology Review, and so on and so forth. The Guardian, I worked as a reporter in Brussels for about 10 years, covering these sort of issues, a lot of climate change and energy policy issues, but, environment more broadly and infectious disease, range of other issues. And I'm also the co-author of People's Republic of Walmart, which is my second book on the history of or a popular introduction to the economic calculation debate.
Good. Okay. Well, that's a good introduction. And you're a Canadian. You're in Victoria, British Columbia. Is that?
I am.
We're not going to hold this against you, the Canadian thing. We've had other Canadians on here. We've even had a few Brits on there. We need the Limeys to kind of level
born in England, so I'm both British and Canadian.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll that's okay. So let's jump right in here because I told you before we started recording, I've been reading Austerity Ecology and just loved it. I thought, your synthesis of a lot of ideas really it rhymed with a lot of the things that I've been thinking about. So you talk about in Austerity Ecology, you talk about the anti-capitalist degrowthers. But what is collapse porn and why are so many people addicted to it? Why are so many people, I guess, getting off on collapse porn?
Yeah.
To really mix my metaphors here.
Oh, collapse porn is just my term for what I guess these days is being called doomism or doomerism, the sort of wallowing and almost appreciation of their belief that the end of the world is nigh. The sort of people that maybe a generation ago would have been, standing on a street corner with a sandwich board saying the end is nigh, and everybody would be walking past them thinking these people are crazy. Today, this is very mainstream politic perspective, particularly on the left, but the liberal left more broadly. The Guardian has almost completely pivoted towards a very, very doomerist or collapse porn perspective. I mean, it's beyond just that. There's a very important sort of journalistic argument around this where the only story that is being told is the worst possible interpretations of climate science or biodiversity loss or nitrogen pollution or plastic pollution, what have you. There's no, they cherry pick the absolute worst sort of possibilities without any sort of discussion of the probability there.
So RCP 8.5 being the one example of this, Roger Pilkey Jr. has written a ton about Absolutely. That. He and I have talked about that on the podcast, that here is this scenario that it calls for these massive increases in coal consumption globally that clearly are not happening. And yet, and it is the most extreme of the climate projections that have been put out by in the various publications. But that's not going to happen. That scenario is not connected to reality. So the question, as you were saying, or that it popped in my head as you were talking about that, about this collapse porn. But is this new? I mean, from what I've, when I've looked at in some of the books I've written about, the progress and so on, this is as old as Rousseau, or is even from going back further about the lapsarian, that we've lapsed from grace of God by divorcing ourselves from nature. Is this a continuation of that? Because it's a religion unto itself, no?
You can go back to the ancient Greeks, and there would be people in the cities writing, very well-to-do people in the cities writing tracts about how Greek society had lost its vigor, having moved from the countryside to the city. And the city was that urbanity is, enfeebles humanity. So it's always we've always had that aspect.
And Jefferson talked about that as well, right?
Jefferson, absolutely. I write about Jefferson's book, the yeoman farmer. His vision of America was yeoman farmer, and he was very, very critical of Hamilton's sort of perspective of nation building. But even though it's always been with us, it is traditionally a fairly minoritarian perspective. It's a relatively new thing where it is very, very dominant in the discourse. And I would make the argument that, I think there's a couple of things that have led to this. The first is, I do think with many respects, certainly publications like The Guardian are being led by their nose. That is to say, in a world where advertising revenues for newspapers and journalists more broadly are collapsing, have been collapsing for about a generation as a result of the internet and this sort of clickbait sells. It is what, in the desperate search for advertising, there are basically two stories about climate change that sell. One is a sort of climate skepticism. The other is one that is the end of the world is nigh, this collapse porn, and a nuanced perspective about how this is a real problem. These are the potential solutions, how to fix this. And let's change the technologies in the face of new evidence. That's a very nuanced, historically very scientifically driven or evidence-based perspective. Just doesn't sell because it doesn't come. You're not producing really sexy headlines.
It's too much too much nuance.
Too much nuance. Yes, absolutely. And the second thing that I think is driving this, particularly on the left, is that since I think it's fundamentally a product of what on the left we would call neoliberalism, a retreat in the 70s and 80s from a comfort with government intervention, with real integration of trade unions into society, sort of the union busting in the 1980s, crackdown on and cuts to social programs, that whole package of things called neoliberalism. Really broke the power of the working classes across much of the West, and the sort of intellectuals who historically were integrated into the working class through the trade unions or alongside the trade unions, so retreated from the class and to the academy and to the media, to the NGO industrial complex, and got completely cut off from regular ordinary working people. And I think that while there's definitely always a role for intellectuals in any sort of social movement, there was the sheer social weight of ordinary working people integrated into energy systems, integrated into transport systems, agricultural systems, manufacturing systems. They just knew how things work because they work, literally at the coalface every day. They work that sort of integration of intellectuals in the working class work to discipline intellectuals from their crazier flights of fancy.
And that's been lost.
That's been lost. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I like what you're saying there, because I think it is exactly in line with what I see in terms of some of these academics, elite academics, and I just get so sick of it. I gotta tell you, Stanford, MIT, Princeton, study after. Oh well, we can do all this stuff with renewables. No problem. Oh, and it's only going to cost this many trillions of dollars, with no understanding of what it means for the working class, for the people who don't, as Jennifer Hernandez says, don't live in the keyboard economy. But this has been adopted wholesale here in the U.S. by the Democratic Party, which in theory has been the party of the working class. And now it's completely flipped. So this idea of energy as the basis of the economy and what it means to the working poor or the working class has been completely lost in their discussion, and now dominated by this, again, this catastrophism that is a similar dynamic at work in Canada is what you see here in the US?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the same in Canada. It's the same in Britain. It's the same in Western Europe. There's no sort of region of the Western world where this hasn't happened. I would argue precisely because of this dislocation of the intellectual classes from the working classes. In Canada, the center of the country is, whether we're talking basically the prairies, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. These are areas which are very, very resource dependent. Alberta, of course, infamous internationally for its oil and gas production. And yes, we absolutely recognize that we have to be switching, making a clean transition in order to solve climate change. But the set of solutions they're put on the table, again by the sort of intellectual class, 100% renewable energy. Those, the pipe fitters, the boiler makers, everybody who is in that sector, they can see, they look that the wages for slapping solar panels on racks, because the solar panels, of course, are made in China, and they're saying, oh, well, it's $16 an hour, and it's this is seasonal work, and it's ununionized, and this in no way is going to replace the maybe $100,000 a year that I'm earning, good family supporting union work, non-seasonal, skilled, intellectually stimulating,
in manufacturing, in automaking, or in oil field, or coal mining, or whatever.
And yet that same sort of intellectual professional in the academy would never make the same sort of mistake about the supposed fungibility between, say, pipe fitting and slapping solar panels on a rack, and say between a dentist and an adjunct professor. They would be very, very clear that a dentist, professional, is earning, maybe $150,000, $200,000 a year. An adjunct professor, also of the intellectual class, of the professional class, but infamously poorly paid because they just got out of university. There's a surplus of university educated folks, and so it's a buyer's market on the part of the administrations of universities. These people are infamously potentially more poorly paid than minimum wage. Nobody would ever make that mistake of that a dentist and an adjunct professor are fungible in terms of work, saying oh, well, there's no more dentists. Imagine that we can't have dentists anymore. Everybody can get a job as an adjunct professor. That's ridiculous. The loss of income would be appalling. Well, they're not able to make the same connection with respect between a pipe fitter or boilermaker or whatever it happens to be, and somebody the unskilled seasonal labor of somebody slapping solar panels on racks or roofs, because they aren't in that world. They aren't familiar with it. But
yet we hear that same argument. Oh, well, this clean energy economy is going to create jobs. I mean, this is the justification for it over and over and over again. I'm going to cut to a couple of things here because I don't want to spend too much time on Rousseau and the rest of it. But in reading a lot of what you've written about the kind of the intellectual background of our underpinnings, really, of this modern Austerian, as you call it, the promoters of this austere lifestyle. That you said that in the summary, you say that you argue that progressives must rediscover their historic Promethean ambitions and counter this reactionary neo-Malthusian ideology that only retards human flourishing but won't save the planet anyway. We want to take over the machine and run it rationally, not turn the machine off. That is great, because this idea of Prometheus, and I had to look up Prometheus. One of the analyses says Prometheus represents the striving of humans and the search for scientific knowledge. He's associated with intellect, knowledge, and genius. The giving of fire to humans can be seen as symbolizing the gifting of reason and intellect to humans. It's a long question or long intro to this point. Well, in January, Bill McKibben, who you criticized throughout the book, he said in January in an article in the New Yorker, the basic rule of thumb for dealing with the climate crisis would be to stop burning things. He's saying we need to abandon fire. I mean, that's what he's saying. I mean, he's saying we humans have to abandon fire. I mean, I can't imagine a more anti-human kind of ideology than that. Am I wrong?
Well, I mean, I think he's probably, I'm certainly no fan of Bill McKibben, but I think he's probably, to be as generous as possible to Bill McKibben in this case.
Yeah, you don't have to be generous. You don't have to be generous here.
He's probably being poetic there with respect to combustion of fossil fuels. But if we take the issue of retreat from discovery, retreat from technology, that sort of anti-Promethean perspective, then he's very much emblematic of that. And we see right across the left the argument, from Naomi Klein through to Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace, there is an argument that we need to degrow. We need to the fund. In Naomi Klein's "This Changes Everything," that her best-selling book on climate change. She argues that the fundamental problem is the Western idea of progress, and that we made a mistake. The very first mistake that we made was Francis Bacon's desire to dominate nature. Well, this runs completely counter to the history of the left, and I'm a man of the left. You can go back to even Marx's Communist Manifesto, and a lot of people know about the book but don't actually read the book, and that includes many so-called Marxists. If you read the book, you see that it is this absolute paean to the marvels of capitalism and industrial technology. The thing was that he wanted to strip modernity of its inequality, of its unfreedom, and spread the wonders of modernity to everybody, not to retreat from modernity. There were historical sort of utopian socialists that he raged against, who wanted to retreat, who are more Rousseauian, who wanted to retreat from modernity, and he hated that. He absolutely despised that. So people like Bill McKibben, Naomi Klein, all these figures that believe that modernity that industrial modernity is the fundamental error. They run absolutely counter to the history of the left.
Well, so let's talk about that a little bit, because you say you're a man of the left and you write for Jacobin, which is which is a socialist magazine. Yeah. Describe your politics, because I'm completely confused about where I belong on the political spectrum. I've been with liberal publications. I've been in conservative outfits, and I just call myself disgusted. Tell me why you identify as part of the left, and how do you describe the left now?
Well, that's a good question with respect to describing the left right now. And I think the left is a very, very sort of broken place at the moment. But I'm a democratic socialist. So that means that I believe that I have critiques of markets. I believe that there's a distinction between let me put it another way. Which means that I want to see a democratization of society, that I don't believe that democracy is only for the political world, but I believe that democracy is for the entirety of society, the entirety of the economy. Anything that affects me, I need to have a democratic say in. And so democratic socialism is simply the extension of democracy to the entirety of the economy. And it is, just to be very, very clear, it is very, very different from what we saw in the Soviet Union under Mao's China. If the very sort of definition of socialism is the extension of democracy, in those countries there was no democracy, so they can't be socialists. In the same way that the Democratic Republic of Congo isn't a democracy, even though they have democracy in the name. So just that's your 30-second answer.
Well, I like that, because one of the things that I've taken away from your work, and also we have a mutual friend, Emmett Penny, talking about the societal goods and the and I write a lot about the electricity business and the electricity markets and so on, is the idea of the electric grid as this commons, and that it would be one of the ultimate expressions, the physical network itself, one of the ultimate expressions of democratic social ideals, right? That we're going to make this system work for everyone, and we're going to make electricity cheap. And that's one of the things that just grills my cheese about what's happening in the United States in terms of the Democrats pushing these fundamentally elitist energy policies that are in direct opposition to what happened during the New Deal and the Rural Electrification Act.
Absolutely. And Tennessee Valley Authority.
And the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935. This was a democratization of energy networks. And so that I think that's the part that, to me, really it strikes the chord in me in your work and Emmett's work, is this idea of an absolute essentiality of understanding the basic network that supports the rest of industrial society. Does that make sense to you? Am I on the side?
Oh, no, you've hit the nail on the head. These systems are cathedrals of I mean, I would say, to be very not provocative in any way, I would say that the Tennessee Valley Authority is a cathedral of American socialism. And it is a gorgeous Promethean vision of this incredibly complex machine that we've built collectively to support all of us to continue to advance and to increase our prosperity, to lift people up. I mean, one of the reasons that Lenin, the very beginnings of the Soviet Union before it got turned into the horror story under Stalin, Lenin described, when he was asked what is the definition of socialism, it was workers' councils, Soviets, in Russian, Soviets plus electrification of the entire country.
Right. Yeah, I use that quote in my new book, A Question of Power. Yeah, which is just amazing. It's amazing.
Harold Wilson in the 1960s, one of the great Labour prime ministers of the UK. He has this very famous speech about the white heat technology, but extending it to everybody, to lift everybody up. And that was always the vision. So I don't understand when I see the Bill McKibbins and Naomi Kleins of the world and the Greta Thunbergs calling for breaking up of that. Of the grid, of decentralizing it. I mean, to me, that is the breaking up of the commons. It is, they dress it up in socialist language, but it's the most neoliberal thing possible. It is, it's breaking up this gorgeous cathedral.
That's a really interesting point there, because one of the points you make, and it's one that I didn't realize until Mark Nelson was on the podcast a few weeks ago, and we were talking about this, but that the rise of Enron, and my first book was on Enron now almost 20 years ago, but that it was the Enronification of the grid in America started at roughly the same time the Enronification of the grid happened in Britain. And now both are suffering within a few months of each other, suffering the same fate, right? Failures of the grid in Texas, but failures of the grid in Britain, and skyrocketing prices, all because of this lack of social, I would use that in broad term, the social control, social democratically monitored, measured, regulated management of the grid, because it was undermined by this neoliberal attack from, we're going to open it to markets and it's going to be the great way to add renewables. It's a point you make in your book, Austerity Ecology. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. And if it were slapped with the name Enron on it, the liberal left would be able to critique it. But because it comes slapped with a green fig leaf, this is the only way they were going to force the big utilities to embrace intermittent wind and solar. And we're going to we'll break it up so that local communities can control it. It suddenly sounds not neoliberal anymore, except it's exactly the same thing. Enronification is exactly what happened. The same thing happened in Europe, and where the Green parties in the European Parliament were. They basically allowed the neoliberals at the heart of the European Commission and within the European Council to finalize the end breakup of public, what remained of public energy companies in the EU, breaking up transmission from distribution, generation from transmission and distribution. And the Greens, I remember interviewing one of the leaders of the Green Party in the European Parliament and saying, how does this fit with, I thought Greens were supposed to be progressive. And he said, well, I would prefer that, we just renationalize them and force them to this, but that's not going to happen because they're mega projects. And so we have to break them up. And so ironically, the neoliberal breaking up of the grid was performed under this, as I say, with the green fig leaf. They were the sharp end of the spear there that allowed the final breakup of the energy companies in Europe.
Because they saw that as a way to promote wind and solar and add it more quickly into the grid. And it could be these private corporations that were the ones that were doing it, right? That they were the ones saying, Enron can do it.
It couldn't possibly it wouldn't enter their mind that it might just possibly be the case that those experts in the energy companies and the trade unions in the energy companies were saying, actually, if you integrate variable renewables at a very high level, you'll be fragile, but Meredith Angwin calls this fragilizing of the grid.
Right.
The only possible understanding of the Green Left at this point is that they're only doing that because they're captured by the fossil fuel lobby, rather than just actually this just doesn't work.
Well, but even for you to say that is that the left has been captured by the fossil fuel. Well, no, of course not. We hate fossil fuels, right? That was the Natural Resources Defense Council, their self-defense after the closure of Indian Point, which was they pushed for, and they said, oh, well, we're really pushing against the hydrocarbon business. Well, what happened after Indian Point closed? And of course, it's replaced by gas-fired generation. Hello, yes. Duh, this is the least surprising thing ever. Right. So
yeah, and the irony of all of this, of course, is that Greenpeace in Germany technically is also a natural gas company. They have a profit-making venture that includes the sale of natural gas. The Green Party in Belgium, as you probably heard, has the energy ministry portfolio in that government, and heading up the shutdown of clean nuclear energy to be replaced by natural gas. So again, over and over again, we see the Green Left being, despite their rage against fossil fuels, regularly captured, often by natural gas interests, because it marries so well with variable renewables.
Right. Well, so talk about Europe. I mean, you lived there for some time, and you mentioned that you're born in Britain. And I was just looking at the headlines today. We're talking just a couple of days before Thanksgiving here in November, but that the day ahead prices in the European market are in some places over $300 a meg or 300 euros per megawatt hour. I mean, they're just seeing a catastrophic result now from this, frankly, insane skein of policies: the overinvestment in renewables, underinvestment in hydrocarbons, and premature closure of their coal and nuclear plants. So, it's almost like they're committing energy suicide, and they're only now starting to realize how dangerous it's been. That's my view. How do you see all this happening, or what do you see?
Well, I think I very much worry that once again, because the Green Left is utterly cut off from ordinary working people, as they have been championing precisely these policies, and these policies are resulting in scandalous electricity prices. I think there will be a generalization of the phenomenon of the gilets jaunes, the yellow jackets in France, but across Europe. And there is a real risk of completely undermining even good climate policies as a result of these suicidal as you say, skein of climate policies. The irony, of course, in all this is that these are really appalling ways to decarbonize society. We know that a good foundation of nuclear energy is both clean. The UN report just came out a few days ago showing that the nuclear power is genuinely, it is the lowest carbon of all energy sources. It's firm. It delivers, high-paying, often unionized, family-supporting incomes. So the unions themselves are calling for this is the main pathway that we need to, or the foundation of the pathway to decarbonization. So you don't have that backlash from working people. They can see themselves in the future in a clean economy, not thrown under the bus. No matter which, the land footprint of nuclear is teeny tiny because of the energy density of the fuel. So, when we talk about climate change, we can't throw biodiversity loss under the bus. And the largest cause of biodiversity loss is land use change. If that's our concern, then once again, nuclear with its tiny land footprint is a bit of a no-brainer with respect to overcoming the issues around biodiversity. So whatever metric they were choosing, ironically, the pathway of a broadly social democratic, eco-modern perspective that the Green Left rages against would deliver a much more rapid decarbonization than the pathway that they're promoting.
Well, so let me talk about the timing here, because I know Austerity Ecology came out in 2015, which was the same year that the Eco-Modernist Manifesto came out. So was this just happenstance? Where I think your book came out, I think, if memory serves, roughly 6 months or so after the Eco-Modernist Manifesto was published. So it was just great minds think alike here, and you were on similar paths?
I think there's a lot of us on the within the environmental community and on the liberal left more generally who were just paying a lot of attention to the evidence. I mean, what happened with me was as a journalist in Europe, I was spending a lot of time in my articles trying to deconstruct climate denialist or climate. I prefer climate skeptic because I think denialism is a deliberate evocation of Holocaust denial, and however much I may disagree with climate skepticism or some levels of climate skepticism, they're absolutely not in the same category as neo-Nazis that deny the Holocaust. So let's just use the word climate skepticism. I spent a lot of time digging deep into the literature to be able to counter those arguments. And it was the same with respect to genetic engineering. The Green left in general, liberal left, is very much opposed to genetic engineering. They're opposed to industrial agriculture. And I just kept coming up over and over and over again. And the literature was saying quite the opposite of what these people were saying. The use of genetic engineering actually reduces the use of pesticides. Nuclear power actually is the safest form of energy that we have, with the fewest deaths per terawatt hour, and so on and so forth. You know the whole the whole stuff. And so I've kind of like looked around at my own team, the left. Look, I'm spending all my time raging against what I consider to be the right on climate skepticism, and with all the scientific literature. I'm saying my own team isn't paying attention to the scientific literature either. And I just got very, very destabilized. And I think that didn't just happen to me. I think that happened to people like Ted Nordhaus and Mike Schellenberger. I think a lot of people had that experience of, hold on a sec, my own team is making some of the same sort of errors as the people that we historically consider to be enemies or ideological enemies. And I think in 2014, 2015, it was coming to a bit of a head. And so there was a lot of sort of emergence of discussion of that. But now we're really seeing maturation of that. There's a whole ecosystem of broadly eco-modern thinking, with eco-modern groups sprouting up in Finland and Australia, in Canada, people out to defend nuclear power, people working alongside the trade unions, within the trade unions, to defend nuclear power. And to be honest, I'm really excited about this because this has a much greater social weight than the professional managerial sort of elites within the NGO university media complex, industrial complex, because there's just so many more people. So I'm very excited about what's going to be happening in the next coming years as sensible, rational, ordinary working people begin to dominate the climate discourse.
Well, and it's maybe the catalyst is going to have to be maybe the energy crisis that now is facing Europe, because I mean, Europe has been leading and the same with California. I put them in the exact same boat in terms of the same things we talked about. And it's what I testified before Congress or the Senate last week, saying overinvestment in hydrocarbons, overinvestment in renewables, underinvestment in hydrocarbons, premature closure of your nuclear and coal plants. And now you're relying on Russia for your natural gas. I mean, this is a bad place to be all the way around.
Absolutely. The only question is which political forces are going to be able to capture the energy coming out of
the political distaste or the political upheaval, I guess, or political unrest, perhaps. Because if people start dying in droves because of cold weather, you would certainly expect this to get a lot more. It really makes our heat right on the politicians to say you've made a big mistake. You've got to figure this out.
Yeah, there's a great danger that perhaps the far right captures some of the anger there, and I would like to see the anger sort of directed in a more constructive, progressive direction. Already, we're seeing in Finland the True Finns, or what used to be called the True Finns. I guess they're just called the Finns now, which is a bit of an exaggeration to call them the far right, but there's certainly a right of center-right party, and they are very much, capturing a deep anger at climate policies, sometimes very irrational climate policies, to be fair, but that anger being directed in a party that is, critical of immigration, very conservative on a range of different issues,
right.
and I find that very, very worrying. I mean, if it's the Marine Le Pens and the True Finns and the AFDs of in Germany of the world that capture the anger, rather than a more democratic socialist perspective, I think it's a recipe for chaos and disaster. Also, fundamentally, because they're on the right, they will not have I would argue that they do not have the correct economics to be able to deliver on the promise. I've said for a number of times now that the left has the correct economics to deliver on the promise of nuclear energy and other clean technologies like carbon capture and storage, synthetic hydrocarbons, negative emissions technologies, because it's so capital intensive up front that
it's going to take a strong hand of government to make it work at scale.
Exactly.
Right.
Whether we're talking about industrial policy or just state build out, it will need some sort of governmental shepherding of the process. And the right conventionally is much more market friendly.
Right.
They may be embracing the correct technologies, but they don't have the right economics. The left has the right economics, but the wrong technologies, because they're anti-nuclear, they're anti-CCS, they're anti-aviation in some cases.
If I can interrupt, because there was a guy that I knew, Vic Reese, who worked at the Department of Energy. He explained it very succinctly. He said, the problem with nuclear is that you need strong governmental support. And so the problem in the U.S. is that Democrats are anti-nuclear and pro-government. The Republicans are pro-nuclear and anti-government. You need politicians who are pro-government and pro-nuclear, right? So that becomes the challenge for this effective climate action at scale, right, is that it's going to require that strong government hand. And I think that's one of the reasons why the nuclear in the U.S. is, I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, but I just find it, it's stuck. Let's be clear. It just is stuck because it doesn't have the kind of government backing on Capitol Hill that other industries do. Let me shift gears, though, and let me reintroduce my guest, Lee Phillips. He's a science writer based in Canada. His book that we're discussing mainly today is Austerity Ecology and the Collapse-Porn Addicts, a defense of growth, progress, industry, and stuff. You can find him at leephillips.work and also on the Google, and that's Lee, L-E-I-G-H, Phillips. You had a really good piece. I read your book on Kindle. And, one of the great things on that thing is you can highlight things and then email yours. Let me read this, because I really thought this is a really beautifully written bit of writing here. You said, in this way, energy can also be seen as a rough proxy for a society's freedom. As a result of our audacity, our ultimate resource, each of the limits imposed upon us by nature that we have breached, from fire that allowed us to expend less food energy intake on digestion and permitted more energy to be given over to our expanding brain, through electric lighting that allows us to stay up after dark, to the technologies of the bicycle, the washing machine, the pill, abortion, and fertility treatments that have chipped away at patriarchy, has required a growing consumption of energy. And it's beautifully written, and it really encapsulates a lot of the ideas that, some of the things I've written, but just more broadly, the absolute essentiality of energy to human flourishing. And yet you repeatedly point out that McKibben, Klein, the rest of them are, we have to use less. We have to do less. We less. Where you do too much, we need to go back to the garden. This is the same kind of thing that we see in Edward Abbey and Thoreau and Rousseau and Malthus, that we've done too much, got to go back. But that's not an argument. What you wrote there is not an argument you see coming from the left.
Historically, you did. I would say that Marx, Engels, Lenin, the grand sweep of social democrats of Europe and Canada and Australia,
the New Dealers in the 30s,
unions, all very, very clear that energy is absolutely essential. We just take the go back to your high school physics classes, and when you very first learn about what is the definition of energy, it's the formal definition of energy within physics is the ability to do work,
right?
That is to move a massive distance. Well, within society, that's actually very applicable. All that energy is the ability in society to work. The more energy that we were able to capture from the rest of the cosmos, the more we are able to do stuff.
Right.
And doing stuff is basically that's freedom, the ability for us to overcome the barriers around us that prevent us from doing things, whether that is the invention of the development of the vaccines. That without the vaccines, we would have been, our freedoms were delimited,
right,
both by the disease and our attempt to prevent infection. Energy is freedom. And the left historically, I mean, you even, again, I hate to just like bang the drum of Karl Marx, but
no one else has done it on the podcast yet. So have a bongos, drums, whatever timpanis, you bang their drum for Marx and Engels, all you like.
There's a sort of widespread misunderstanding. The primary concern of Marx was inequality. I wouldn't say that he wasn't interested in that, but fundamentally he's concerned about freedom. Drawing on this Hegelian understanding of history, that the steady, the story of human history, the red thread that runs throughout all of human history, is the steady expansion of human freedom. And Marx just basically makes the argument, an extension of the radical Enlightenment, saying that there are certain contradictions within markets, within the commodity form, within capitalism, that need to be transcended in order to expand our freedom still further. And whether you agree or disagree doesn't matter. The point being that freedom was the beating heart of Marx's argument. And if energy is freedom, then the argument that we should pull back from energy, that we should reduce our energy consumption. Now, I'm interested in energy efficiency. There's no point in wasting anything. But at the same time, we should always be wanting more energy. To ever expand our freedom. That the expansion of energy consumption is in many respects what Marx is calling for. I know that sounds weird in the contemporary left, but I would say that Marx was an energy maximalist.
Wow, that's great. I don't know my Marx. There are a lot of books I haven't read, and Marx's books are some.
Oh, well, once this comes out, I'll be absolutely destroyed by the Marxists on Twitter.
Marx was an energy maximalist. I like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was, I'm thinking back about the New Dealers and Burton Wheeler from Montana, George Norris from Nebraska, and Norris was a great populist, right? Started as a Democrat, converted to a Republican, the senator from Nebraska. I mean, he was a tremendous proponent of energy for the people, that he saw this as the absolute way of liberation of farm women, of farm girls, that this, and Lyndon Johnson got to Washington in 1937 after the bill, the REA and the Public Utility Holding Company Act were passed. But he came from the rural areas in Texas, right? And this was his same view. It was FDR's view. I mean, FDR, some of his first speeches he gave when running for president, were talking about electrification and the ability of providing more energy to everyone, right? And including the rural areas. So that's an interesting parallel, and one that I think is largely forgotten, and unfortunately by American Democrats, completely forgotten, because all of the policies that they're proposing, particularly in this Build Back Better Act, I look at it, it's all regressive, every darn bit of it. They've lost touch with, as you point out, I think that's a really important one, that the intellectuals have lost touch with the working class. And that's dangerous, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we could go on a tangent to talk about how the attractions of conservative populism, speaking to those to Rust Belt America, or to the north of England, the deindustrialized north of England, or the Red Belt and the north of Paris that has been deindustrialized and that historically voted for the Communist Party. And how those people are being, seduced by sort of right-wing populism, because the traditional liberal left is no longer speaking to those communities, is completely neoliberalized and is refusing to talk about reindustrialization, large projects, infrastructure that can can return family, as I say, family supporting unionized incomes to those communities. I do think that moving forward, a real solution is this sort of eco-modern, progressive, social democratic, populist perspective that is able to restore in the United States, restore the American family, just restore family supporting incomes to the Rust Belt, can make life livable again in the deindustrialized north of England, can make people comfortable in the center of Canada, the resource communities there, and stabilize society a little bit once again.
It's very destabilized. It's very unstable. Unstable.
Sorry.
Well, no, it's definitely unstable now. But I want to follow on what you said there, because you make another point toward the end of Austerity Ecology about this need for planning, right? That there needs to be that there need to be policymakers and regulators who are deciding how we're going to plan for this. And this is one of Meredith Angwin's point in her book, Shorting the Grid, about these RTOs. They're not charged with planning. They're charged with making sure that, the electricity flows here. We're not in charge of resilience and reliability. That's not our thing, right? So, but your argument then, could you put it this way, or is it correct for me to put it this way? You're arguing for a stouter government that's more responsive to people, but that a government that is going to do big projects, nuclear being a key part of this, because that's what I hear Emmett Penny say. Is that a fair assessment of what you're saying?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my second book that I co-wrote with economist Michał Ryszporski was The People's Republic of Walmart. Is a defense of economic planning. In many respects, it answers the question that I pose in Austerity Ecology, where in Austerity Ecology I say that the solution to climate change, to other environmental issues, is not degrowth, it's not retreat from modernity, it's not retreat from industry. It is economic planning. That's actually the solution.
An embrace of industry, an embrace of planning to understand what needs to happen for adaptation and mitigation. Then,
it isn't just about sort of mega projects. Even if we talk about sort of small modular reactors and other forms of advanced nuclear, the grand dream there is that this is a technology that hopefully will be much more amenable to markets. Maybe because you can produce that or potentially in a factory or in a shipyard, and then you have economies of serious production. And so hopefully the idea there is that the upfront capital costs are much lower than a large nuclear power plant. At the same time, because this is I wouldn't say it's unproven technology, but it's new technology, and we need to be able to take it from the lab bench and even sort of paper reactors through to commercialization.
Right.
Well, that valley of death requires a lot of government shepherding, i.e., industrial policy.
Sure.
So whether we're talking about sheer, conventional public service, publicly owned energy utilities, building out big mega project infrastructure, or we're talking about industrial policy, where we still, at the end of the day, have market actors. It's still government that is planning, that is shepherding the economy. It's a retreat back to, not a retreat. It's a revival of the ideas of the sort of mid-century. I mean, the French build out under the Mesmer plan, their build out of nuclear power plants. In the space of about 11 years, that was a very étatiste, as in French they would say étatiste, a very, very sort of governmentalist project. And it's, the Breakthrough Institute did an analysis and found that this was the most rapid decarbonization that has ever occurred in history. So we do have to go. My main argument is we really do have to get over our phobia of government planning. The crucial thing is that we have to make sure that it is genuinely democratic. One of the reasons that the Margaret Thatchers and Ronald Reagans of the world in the 1980s were so successful, and why they electorally successful, why their arguments fell on such fertile soil, was that there was a real paternalism, I think, within the social democratic welfare state. Things like within council estates, or what you would call projects in the US. In the UK, you have these stories about how there would be the council estate bureaucrats checking whether young women had a man over for the night, because if they're unmarried, they're not supposed to do that. And that level of, like, who is this bureaucrat telling me who I can sleep with?
Right.
And so I think we do have to, like, it isn't merely a return back to the welfare state of the 40s through the 1970s. We have to come up with a new vision, which is genuinely democratic, not paternalistic, that isn't a group of bureaucrats that are once again separated from ordinary working people. It has to be
responsive government.
Responsive government, absolutely, 100%. Yeah.
It's a tall charge.
It is going to be harder in the United States, and I think in some of these other countries that have a long tradition of social democracy. I think Bernie Sanders, I was a big supporter of Bernie Sanders and still am, because he led this revival of social democracy or democratic socialism in the United States. I disagree with him profoundly with respect to nuclear energy. I think his climate policies are completely captured by the NGO, the Green Left. But fundamentally, his economic policies are exactly what I think is necessary. If we could have a sort of a Bernie Sanders, maybe a younger Bernie Sanders next time around, sort of figure that is absolutely economically populist, but is eco-modern. And I would also add, maybe, drop the sort of the identity politics as well. I mean, right. I think he's very good on this. I think AOC is not very good on this. I think Bernie Sanders doesn't have a lot of time for the identity politics. I think he's much more universalist. But I think that would be an amazing package. I think it's a winning package. And ironically, I think sometimes some of the things that even Joe Manchin talks about when he goes and speaks to the AFL-CIO and about decarbonization. You look at his speech, the AFL-CIO, and I think it was 2019 or 2020. I wrote about it recently in an article that's coming out in the next few days. He talks about how the American working class built this country, and we did everything that we were supposed to do. You did everything. I'm not American, but my career's right there in many respects.
Yeah, sure.
And then with he describes it as being like the Vietnam vet coming home from the war and not being wanted. It was like, the coal miners, the pipe fitters, the boilermakers, everybody, the Teamsters, they built the country. And then with the clean transition, with decarbonization, it's like, we don't need you anymore. You're forgotten.
And the system is betraying them.
Exactly. And so even
or abandoning them. Maybe abandoning is better than betraying, but nevertheless. But how much of that is go ahead.
So even somebody like Joe Manchin, if he's honest, if he's really being honest about what he said in that speech, then he is also, which is he's supposed to be a moderate Democrat. Even he is talking about, with respect to economic populism, there's an element of that there in what he said as well. Now, again, I don't know if he has the right economics to back that up, but certainly we can't write off those people either. If they're talking about and getting applause at the AFL-CIO being the major trade union central in the United States. Right. Not everyone might not know that. Sorry.
Well, right, and I think it's interesting, to talk about Manchin, because where does he come from? West Virginia, one of the poorest states in the country, right? And
used to be a blue state,
right? And now is in play, but it's also that it's a hydrocarbon producing state and a big one that's heavily reliant on coal, and that he knows where he's coming. He knows where he's from.
Exactly.
And he knows who's going to vote for him. And so he can't ascribe to this same, I'm going to call it what it is, this elitist energy policy being pushed by Nancy Pelosi and all of the, and AOC and the rest of them all of them come from big cities, and they don't really give a shit about what happens in rural America. Well, Manchin does, and he better, because he's going to be out of a job.
Oh yeah. I mean, I was reading an article in, I think it was In These Times, which is a sort of venerable old left-wing magazine in the US. And it was an article about exactly this. And there was a description of the United Mine Workers of America, UMWA. who have, had so many struggles over the years, where the coal companies have just abandoned their commitments to paying into pensions,
sure,
and disability. And mining is a difficult job, and so there's a lot of widows. There's a lot of disabled people and this article in these times dismissed the UNMWA as, well, they're basically a retirees organization these days. They're not really a fighting union anymore. As a way to explain why they were critical of AOC's Green New Deal. And I just thought, I was furious when I read that. The struggles that these people have fought over the years, and bitter struggles. There's an ongoing, many months long strike at the moment over exactly these issues. But
it goes back to it's the detachment of the elite intellectuals from the working class, right? This whoever this writer was, and I'm not familiar with the piece, but I don't think they've been to a coal mine, because I've been to coal mines. I've seen those UMW stickers on the Ford F-150s, right? There are a lot of them, and these are serious working folks, and they know. But it's that reversal that, to go back to what you talked about before, that the Republicans have then become the party that appeals to the working class because they hear Trump and others saying, we know what you're suffering for. We know your story.
Interestingly, I think the only other person who is able to go into West Virginia and not be booed was Bernie Sanders, for exactly the same reason.
The economic populism.
Yeah, economic populism. Yeah.
Interesting. You, in your bio, I noticed this in a couple of places in your bio, you said that you write about the interface, and this sounds somewhat similar, and I say this as a compliment, between how Roger Pielke describes his work, Roger Pielke Jr., the interface between science and society, especially philosophy of science, economics, and politics. If there is a theme that unites most of my work, it is exploring the emergence in the 21st century of a framework of geoanthropic systems governance, or the struggle over how we as the globally dominant species are beginning to steward human and earth systems in a more rational, democratic, and egalitarian fashion. So, I mean, that sounds, you're an eco-modernist, right? That this is the Anthropocene and you're wanting to figure out how government makes it better. Is that a way to think about it as well?
Well, I mean, not just government. I mean, I think technology, but and the right philosophies and in society as well. I would say that I'm very excited to be living at this moment. I do think it's a very, very thrilling moment in human history to be in the days when we as a species realize that we command the earth, and we have to move from being unwittingly commanders of the earth into conscious commanders of the earth. Yeah. I mean, that's a fascinating scientific, technological, engineering, political, philosophical, religious. I'm an atheist, but spiritual moment to be in, where we are becoming these as gods, basically. Right. I mean, I think it's
Stuart Brand's line. We're as God, we might as well get good at it. Well, so then talk about atheism, because that's interesting, because I still identify as a Christian. I'm raised Catholic. But the religiosity around the doomism, the religiosity around the catastrophism is something I've talked about on the podcast. I had Sally Trimbath on, who's a theologian, talking about these very same things, about this catastrophism of climate change as being the end times, right? And we've sinned and we have to go back. So how does your atheism inform your writing then in that regard? Because I'm saying I've had Christians on, I've had Jews on, I've talked about, these issues, but I don't know that I've talked to anyone about who's a self-professed atheist talking about some of these same issues.
I'm very religiously informed. I may be an atheist now and have been for many years. My faith just fairly, just steadily dropped away over the years. But I was born into the Church of England, so Anglican Episcopalian in the UK, in the US, you would say. Right. And raised in the United Church in Canada, which is a Protestant church, mainly because that was the closer church than the Anglican one. And my mom
didn't want to go that far. Yeah, okay, I got it. Church of convenience. That's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're nice. They're really friendly. So let's go there. but actually, as a teenager, the liberation theology, the Catholic worker movement, that had a huge, like, profound influence on me. And that was probably what led me into becoming a democratic socialist. So even though my faith dropped away, I'm still very much informed by a lot of that, and I certainly know about the history of religion and churches. And so this millenarianism, there's always been some people within religion who, it's not a mainstream idea within religion, but certainly, in the turning of the last millennium, not 2000 but 1000, there was a period of heightened millenarianism, doomerism. It's something that recurs in human society. I think I don't know what the psychology is. I didn't study psychology at university. One of the sciences I didn't study. My mom's a psychologist, so maybe I should read a bit more. Maybe there's something in there to be able to describe why it is that there's a section of humanity that regularly is attracted to that sort of doom mongering. I don't have any answers on that either from psychology, from science, or from religion. I just know that it does regularly happen.
Well, but I mean, isn't that always been so, that the religion requires this idea of the catastrophe looming to instill the need for penance, right? That we need reform. We need to get right with, in this case, as Sally Trimbath talked about, get right with God, and God just happens to be the earth, right? And that this is that earth supplanting God is the one to be worshipped.
As an atheist, I'm very attracted to that idea that so there's something inherent within religion that leads to a sort of doom-mongering. But the truth of the matter is that most of the people that we're talking about with respect to the green left, the climate left, most of them are atheists or just non-religious. And so I think it's something deeper than that. Also, on the other hand, I know lots of religious people who have no time at all for the end of the world is nigh story. So,
yeah, that's fair. That's a fair point.
I'm basically saying I don't know. I just don't know. I mean, there's a book to be written about that.
Gotcha. Well, there's lots to be written.
But not by me.
Not by me. Not by me either. Well, so describe what's happening in Canada now. You live in Victoria, British Columbia, right? Yeah. Is it? And I was there a long time ago. I remember going to Bouchard Gardens. That's the only.
Oh, really?
Yes,
okay.
It was quite lovely. It made a big impression on me. I thought, wow, this is
cute little university town, capital. It's many of these places in North America where the capital of a state or the capital of a province is actually one of the smaller towns or smaller cities. So right. It's as if you've been here, it's very quaint like that.
Right. So tell me about the politics in Canada now. I mean, Trudeau is under a lot of pressure, and it seems that the schisms within Canada in terms of the provincial interests, and you mentioned Ontario versus Alberta, Quebec versus Alberta. What's the state of play in your view? How's Trudeau doing in your view?
Well, oh gosh, not very well. I don't think. I mean, I'm a democratic socialist, so I'm a supporter of the New Democratic Party here, which is our Social Democratic Party. Right. It's basically a Bernie Sanders type party. Yeah. Which unfortunately I think has the right economics, but again the wrong technology. There's a lot of anti-nuclear sentiment within the party, although the party isn't, I don't think, officially anti-nuclear. Anyway. The Liberal Party is the centrist party, which governs our country, and the Liberal Party pivots between a sort of center right and a center left, and is currently controlled mostly by the center left. Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, our Deputy Prime Minister, those sort of figures, they definitely come from the left of the party.
And your Environment Minister Guilbeault is right. He's a famous anti-nuclear activist who. Chris Kiefer confronted recently.
I can't stand him. I have to say, he's the classic example of everything that I hate within my book, Austerity Ecology. And I think it's a real shame because a few years ago, the Liberal government under Trudeau did actually commit to a small modular reactor roadmap. revival of nuclear energy. I think it's a shame that it wasn't broadened out to a revival of how to make to revive the CANDU reactor, which is just like it's a
right. Yeah.
Again, it's a cathedral of Canadian innovation, and do a sort of South Korea where we begin to sell it around the world. I think Canada. One of the selling points of Canada is that we're basically trusted around the world in terms of our regulation, that if Canada gets it right, it must be okay. It must be broadly safe.
Right.
In a way that Russia and China aren't really that trusted in, say, sub-Saharan Africa or India. And so I think there's a real Canada could have been, and I worry that the window now is closing for this, but Canada really could have been the force in the world that begins to revive nuclear in the developing world. I don't think that's the only thing. I think that small modular reactors are absolutely essential as well. I'm not one of these people like Mike Schellenberger who is like 100% conventional. Remote extraction is not going to be able to be decarbonized without small modular reactors. Remote communities like in Nunavut and in the far north, that really is the pathway forward. So I'm in all of the above there, but and I thought broadly the federal Liberals were leaning in the right direction. I felt because they're centrists, they could have been a lot more robust. There were tens of millions thrown at small modular reactors instead of more substantial billions. And I think the NDP, the New Democratic Party, would have been able to actually more robustly support that. But even that, I think it is beginning to close now. And I think the problem is we've moved, there was a cabinet shuffle. And so the Minister of Natural Resources, who was really very bullish, Seamus O'Regan, a really, really great guy. He's from Newfoundland. I think that if he were from the west coast of the country, he would have been a New Democrat. Unfortunately, in Newfoundland on the east coast, there aren't a lot of New Democrats. So I think he joined the Liberal Party, but I think he's just a classic social democrat. And it really, he's really banging the drum for nuclear. He said we can't have decarbonization without nuclear. It was, I thought this is actually pretty much what I'd like to see. Like see more robust funding, but it's pretty good. But I think that Trudeau, because Trudeau is a bit of a flibbertigibbet, he's very capricious with his policies. If something doesn't work within a few months, it doesn't produce immediate political returns, he'll move on to something else. And I think he thought that nuclear small modular reactors would result in an overnight increase in Liberal support in the center of the country, and it didn't. And of course, it's not. It's going to take some time to.
It takes years. This is one of the problems, right?
Absolutely. And so now he's pivoted away from that. He's stuck Stephen Gilbert in the Environment and Climate Change Ministry, and he's in the Natural Resources. It's what's his first name? Last name's Wilkinson. Anyway, and he's very, very soft on nuclear as well. And certain Stephen Guilbeault is anti-nuclear. And so I think what has happened, and I'd really like to speak to some people in the cabinet to find out on background to find out exactly what's gone on there. But I really suspect that Trudeau has pivoted away from that. And I think it's a really, really great shame for Canada. I hope I'm wrong. I hope folks like Chris Kiefer and Mobilizing Nuclear Labour and Canadians for Nuclear Energy are going to be able to turn that around. But at the political level, the sort of high political level, I'm more pessimistic than I was just a few years ago.
Mm. Well, it's interesting as you say that, because I was just thinking about Macron in France now with the energy crisis. They're saying, hey, SMRs, yeah, we're all about it. We're going to make this happen now. But let me come back to Canada. I've been to Canada a few times, and one of my heroes now is Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you like him, but he's remarkable. And I don't know what you think about Rex Murphy, but I listened to a podcast where Murphy was interviewed by Peterson, and I thought Rex Murphy, who's a columnist with the National Post, I don't know if your politics align with his, but I just thought he had a remarkable story. He was a Newfoundlander, and just his life story was just remarkable to me. And he's got this great voice, and then the two of them together, I just thought was just remarkably captivating.
So this is probably where you and I will have some disagreement.
Okay, that's fair. You can't, you hate Jordan Peterson.
I can't stand Jordan Peterson. I think he's a charlatan. His 12 rules for life. He says, clean your room.
Yeah,
and then there's a video of him, his own room, and it's complete cluttered mess. Now, I think he's a snake oil salesman.
Okay, fair enough.
To be honest, I think that Jordan Peterson, and this is very different from any sort of discussion around climate change, but I do think that what the success of Jordan Peterson comes from the fact that there's a group of young men, not all white men. There's a lot of men of color who also feel this way, who feel very lost at sea in the current environment. They graduate from university or college or not, and there aren't a lot of jobs for them. They're struggling to pay the rent or to get a mortgage because of the housing crisis. And it's really, really tough. Yeah. And all they see all day long in the media is that men are just the worst. So I think that Jordan Peterson was able to speak to those people. And I wish that we on the left were able to speak to them instead. And this is where I come to my arguments around identity politics versus universalism. If we are saying that even working class men who are really struggling at the moment are horrible human beings, if we can say that a black female billionaire is oppressed by a homeless straight white man, I think our moral compass is fundamentally broken there.
Right.
Universalism wants to lift everybody up.
Yeah.
And recognizes that it is not actually in the interest of men for there to be sexism, that it's not actually in the interest of straight people for there to be homophobic, that it's not actually in the interest of white people for there to be racism. I mean, the democratic socialist argument historically with respect to racism was that racism divides the working class. If one group of workers of one color is raised up against another group of workers, of a different color, that group of workers will cross the picket line when that other group of workers goes on strike, and vice versa. Right. And so both of them are undermining each other's ability to have higher wages and better conditions. This is why the very first sort of organizing against racism in the United States in the 1930s came from the Communist Party, from the trade unions, and it was out of a sort of, we're being fucked here because our workers are divided. Everybody will stab on each other depending on their race. We have to overcome racism in order to have a unified union.
That there was, I see. So the racial differences have to be put aside and put the class issue first.
That's right. Because it is in white working class people's own interest to overcome racism, which transcends this idea that we should feel sorry for black people. I mean, I do think it's or Hispanics or Asians or indigenous people. It's no. We're being screwed over by this as well. Whenever any working class person is being screwed over on the basis of race, that undermines our wages and conditions. It is our own interest. I mean, one should also fight against racism just because racism is bad, but fundamentally, it is in your own interest.
Yeah, and this is that's an interesting. I like that idea because I see so many of these issues now, particularly in the U.S. That's divisions along class lines, right? And that this is one of Michael Lynn's arguments as well, right? That this is really the division in America. And I tend to agree with him. I think that is absolutely right. That there is and we see this now with this soaring inflation, energy prices, that who's getting hurt? Well, it's the poor and the working class, right? They're not, the wealthy folks. They can afford Tesla Powerwalls and EVs and all the rest of this. Yes. The working class, hell no. They're driving old Ford F-150s and Silverados, and the price of gasoline matters to them a lot. And so that to bring it back to the energy issue. So I just want to talk a little bit about, we've been talking for more than an hour now, and so I want to tie it up here pretty soon. My guest is Lee Phillips. You can find him at leephillips.work, Lee, Leigh, Phillips with 2 L's. I just want to talk for a minute about your book, The People's Republic of Walmart, how the biggest corporations are laying the foundation for socialism. So I wrote this question: how are they laying the foundation for socialism? Because I don't generally think, and I don't shop at Walmart a lot. Do you shop at Walmart?
I do, yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. So how is it laying the foundation for socialism? Because that's one book title that I thought, okay, now I didn't have time to read that book. I read Austerity Ecology, but how is it laying the foundation for socialism?
So it's more laying the foundation for questions around economic planning.
Okay.
That subtitle, the publisher came up with that because they thought I would sell more. Yes. When it came out, there was like Bernie Sanders and there was Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. It's very popular, very salient sort of word. I mean,
and this book was published in 2019, right? 2 years ago.
2019.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Whereas Austerity Ecology was 2015.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Please continue.
So so the People's Republic of Walmart is a popular introduction to the economic calculation debate, sometimes called the socialist calculation debate, which began in the 1920s between conservative economists and left-wing economists as to whether it was feasible to engage in economic planning. The argument was, I've got a few minutes left here, so how can I sort of constrict this? Basically, that any level of planning requires an understanding and knowledge of so many variables in a system, all along production supply chains, that a set of bureaucrats to be able to capture all that information will inevitably make mistakes. They won't capture the entirety of it. There's also discovery within markets about what people want. And how can bureaucrats go out and find this information? There will always be gaps, and therefore those gaps will lead to mismatches between supply and demand. Those mismatches between supply and demand will create a chaos. That chaos will result in sort of authoritarianism to try to resolve that. Bada bing, bada boom, you've got the Soviet Union under Stalin. So this is sort of the argument. The irony is, of course, that Walmart, the largest corporation in the world in terms of revenues, its revenues are not quite as large as the Soviet Union at its height, but sort of roughly on the same scale as the Soviet Union. Even though they exist within a market, internally, it engages in vast planning of millions of products. And activities between different departments.
Complex supply chains, complex transportations, complex logistics, trucks, airplanes, all this sort of stuff.
It's a logistical wonder.
And what employs 2.5 million people, something like it. It's a massive business.
It is. It's absolutely gargantuan. And there was a sort of throwaway line from this sort of Marxist literary theorist, Frederick Jameson, about 10 years ago or so, where he said that, the left is insufficiently a utopian at the moment. It's insufficiently visionary. The real visionaries at the moment are Walmart. And it was just this throwaway line in a little essay that he'd written. And me and Michal Rzorsky, my co-author, we thought, well, that's kind of true, actually. It is a logistical wonder. Let's take Frederick Jameson's throwaway line there and actually expand it and actually investigate. And so we do a lot of research into how Walmart is structured, its supply chains, its logistics, how it works. But not just that, we also look at Amazon, which is another logistical wonder. We look at the National Health Service in the UK, this fully integrated socialized medical system. We look at Sears, where ironically the incoming CEO of Sears a number of years ago was so much of a libertarian that when he took over the company and he looked inside the box and he thought, all this planning going, all this economic planning, this is socialism. And so we instituted markets between different departments. And of course, these different departments are they're competing against each other. There's no interest in profit making for the enterprise as a whole. And it leads to as we know, Sears is basically fallen apart.
Sure.
So, and then we use a couple of other different examples. We talk about the Pentagon and draw on some of the work of the sort of neo-Keynesian economist Mariana Mazzucato, and in how the Pentagon is this great example of economic planning and industrial policy to come up with new technologies. Pretty much all the major technologies, from miniaturization to GPS to Siri in your smartphone, were basically developed by the Pentagon. Why was it able to do that? Is because the Pentagon, being a public service, doesn't have to have a return on investment by the end of 4 quarters or whatever. So there's an entrepreneurialism that's taken in. Anyway, we use all these different examples to talk about how that conservative argument in the 1920s about economic planning is just wrong. The evidence is in now that economic planning at scale can work.
and it can bring higher living standards to the people, right? Make goods and services more available at lower price, at more convenient.
100%. If we look at China right now, I certainly have, as a democratic socialist, I have enormous criticisms of the authoritarianism of the Chinese Communist Party. But I would say that the indicative planning, which is not too different from some of what India was doing in the post decolonization period and what France was doing in the post-war period, where the state really is sort of guiding the economy while there's still large parts of market activity. There's no question that has been an economic miracle. They've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty within a generation. It's absolutely outstanding economically. Let's see if we can't marry something like that to a democratic structure
that would be responsive and democratic. Exactly. And that would be taking on these big challenges. Well, so Lee, this has been a great conversation. I like to ask two questions at the end of my podcast because I'm always interested. There are a few questions I like to ask. I always ask entrepreneurs, what's the hardest part of your job? And, they invariably say managing people. But I always ask my guests, so what are you reading these days? What books are on your shelf? I know you have in front of a whole shelf full of books, but what's at the top of the list these days?
It was at the top of the list these days. I'm reading a couple of books on other hominins, so other hominin species, so Neanderthals, Denisovans. I can never pronounce this right, but the Flores, other early human species that for a long time we thought had lived at very different epochs than humans, and now we're realizing that there was about 5 or maybe even 6 different human species that lived at the same time. And I'm finding this very, very fascinating. I'm also, one of the reasons I'm reading these books is doing a bit of research into, it's helping me out with the research for my next book, which is tentatively titled Dominion. It's a sort of an exploration of the history and science and philosophy of human exceptionalism. It's going to be making a defense of human supremacy.
Human supremacy in terms of the Anthropocene, about our management
absolutely.
of the
along the lines of what we were talking about a few minutes ago. Rather than we have to basically recognize that the reason that we should be concerned about climate change, biodiversity loss, these sorts of issues is because they undermine humans. It's not because they undermine the planet. Planet isn't dying. The planet is incredibly robust.
Right. The planet's going to be fine. It's us we got to worry about.
It's us who might be endangered, or not even if it isn't endangered. We're undermining the optimum conditions under which we flourish.
Right.
So the argument, it's a sort of marriage of sort of deep geological discussion, paleoecology, anthropogeny, so discussion of the emergence of humans.
Anthropogeny. That's a new word for me. So the history of the human species, then
the emergence of
the human species. Gotcha. So, and when is the Dominion? Would you have a publication date on that, or
I don't have I know my agent is like, I'm sure he's pulling his hair out that I still haven't got the early part of the manuscript to him, which was supposed to be with him a long time ago, so he can go around. He can go off, and
I'm not gonna bust you over that. So then, last question then, Lee. So, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that I love humans. I mean, I think we're just an absolutely incredible species. We're the universe becoming aware of itself. I think we're profoundly precious. And I definitely think that we are the big as what's his name? David Deutsch, the physicist, in his book The Beginning of Infinity. I think he's not wrong that this moment is the beginning of an infinite expansion of human freedom. If we, from basically 1750 through to today, this moment is, geologically and even in terms of the history of our species, a blink of an eye. But this is the scientific revolution, the radical enlightenment, delivery of democracy and freedom. That revolution that is incomplete and that we're living through at the moment it's the beginning of a very radical upward trajectory for our species. And I am profoundly optimistic about what we will achieve.
I like that. My friend Molly Ivan said, "Optimistic to the point of idiocy." That's.
I think that's probably what my left-wing critics would say. That optimistic to the point of idiocy. That they genuinely think that I'm an idiot because pessimism for them is the bread and butter at the moment. I think we need a healthy dose of optimism.
Amen to that, my friend. Amen to that. Well, great. Well, Lee Phillips, this has been a great conversation. I really have enjoyed it quite a lot. Yeah. Lee is the author of Austerity, Ecology, and the Collapse Porn Addicts, A Defense of Growth, Progress, Industry, and Stuff, as well as the co-author of The People's Republic of Walmart, How the World's Biggest Corporations Are Laying the Foundation for Socialism. Those are available, I'm sure, where all fine books are sold. You can find Lee at...
you can get them from Walmart, too.
You can get them from Walmart there, even better. And you can find him at leephillips.work on the interweb. So, Lee, thanks a million for being on the podcast.
Thanks,
I sure
Robert.
Appreciate it. Yeah. And to all of you in podcast land, tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. Until then, see ya.